determine by the reading whether the containerized material is safe to handle by hand in a short period of time.
Right.
Now, when you open the container, the reading increases, I understand, by a large number.
Right.
Is there a multiplier in there?
The shield that we saw changes the dose rate by about a factor of 10, about 10 times higher outside the shield than in it.
And that's why they have the container, so you can safely handle it, but obviously if the container is open, it does pose a health risk, as Mr. Holland has described.
If the container is opened, you would have an inner bottle with the radioactive material in it. If that bottle were smashed, then you would have the powder. We know that that inner bottle was intact. It was not distributed.
How would one obtain this? I mean, how easy is it for these to have their hands on this stuff? Where do they have it?
Radium has been used over the years in many applications, including medical applications for treatment of cancer and diagnostic purposes, even in doctor's offices in your local neighborhood, dating back to the 1940s. It's also been used in industrial applications. It's been used as a check source for instrumentation and that sort of thing. It is controlled. It's still too early to tell how exactly individuals like this would have gotten their hands on this material.
This amount that was obtained, could it come from a lab? Could it come from what kind of source? You don't dig it up in your backyard.
It could have come from any of those sources that I indicated: a doctor's office, an industrial setting, a laboratory.
How much was found? Like how many pounds or ounces or whatever you measure it in?
The quantity found would have fit in this container.
I think we estimated somewhere around a pound. Is that correct?
It would have been just a few ounces of radium proper.
In all 5 containers?
I'm sorry, of radium and their containers. I have no idea how much radium proper was in.
Is the radium pure, or had it been altered at all? Were you able to determine whether the radium was pure if it had been altered?
You didn't do any lab work on this yet, did you?
The only analysis we have shows that it was radium. I'm not sure what your question is implying. Okay. Radium was easily obtained for medical purposes over many years in very pure form, and at this point, that's what we think it is.
And I think any other questions on the technical aspects of it would be unfair, because you've really been out in the field. I know you've been working most of the night, and we still have a lot more work to do on it. And I would.
Could you just open that up for me? What the sources might be? I mean,
No, I don't. We don't know at this time. And as I usually say, and I mean it, the investigation is continuing. Much too early to determine. We do know one thing. According to Mr. Holland's check this morning, there is no material of this nature missing from the inventory of the laboratory. Okay. So we've at least satisfied ourselves that it didn't come from there.
Is this the work of a militia or a militia-type group? You see looking at material.
Well, once again, it's a little early to say. We've tried to pull in as much intelligence information about the individual, and thus far we can't tie him into. First of all, we don't have any information that, other than the Long Island militia, which is a fife and drum corps, that there are any militias on Long Island. Hopefully that will bear out further investigation, but that doesn't stop individuals from harboring particular political views that are, as you can see, closely aligned with people who advocate a lot of things about the government that most of us don't approve of. I will say that we recently had a situation where a person was indicted in this county for wholesale. He was wearing military uniforms, conning his way onto helicopter flights, living a complete separate life, which was all things. So we have, and it has nothing to do with our water on Long Island. We do have our share of strange individuals, but this one, the military uniforms is one thing. He can live his own fantasy life. They go into helicopters. I get very annoyed about that, but when I see that type of behavior closely coupled not only with rifles, knives, handguns, Obviously, those are empty canisters for 81 millimeter white phosphorus mortars. I don't know where the mortars are, but I tell you that as an old soldier, that gives me the willies, because they didn't call it Willie Peter for nothing. It's a very, very explosive, burning agent that once you've seen it, you never want to be anywhere near it when it goes off. Why the mine detector? I don't know whether they have too many mines out in Bellport, but you don't know what's in the minds of these people, and that's what makes it more dangerous. True, he was overheard by our office in this instance, but how many other times he did it, we have no idea. But we're certainly going to prosecute this case very, very vigorously.
How did you become aware of these two individuals?
Well, as you know, the Rackets Bureau conducts a series of different investigations, criminal investigations. They develop all sorts of leads and informants, and one of them proved to be very highly productive in developing a lead into this individual. Other than that, I don't think you would want me to say more, and if you did, I wouldn't.
You specifically what was overheard?
Yes, and that's... I'm not... No, it's not the policy of this office to bug private homes.
What do you know about their background in terms of employment,
Yes,
families?
I do know that the individual, Mr. Ford, was previously employed as a uniformed court officer in Suffolk County, I believe. That I understand he's retired from that position. Other than that, I don't know much about him, except he headed up a UFO organization, which I always think is very informative. The second... you'd have to go to your clips. I understand he's the president of maybe it's the Long Island UFO. I don't go to their meetings. UFO Network. And I don't mean to denigrate people who sincerely believe it, but, you know, it does. Since most of us haven't seen it, I'm a doubting Thomas, I guess. The other individual has a rather extensive criminal record, mostly burglaries, and is someone we were well aware of for some period of time.
Are you looking for any other suspects at this point?
Well, the investigation is continuing, and other than that, quite frankly, your presence here indicates that the news media, ever vigilant, tumbled onto this in the early morning hours. I would never accuse you of using police scanners, but I don't know how else you knew everybody was out there. And in this instance, it could have proved problematic to law enforcement. It didn't, but I can imagine many scenarios where we would not want to go public right away with the news. But all right, I've said that. You know my position on about investigations. We should be permitted to investigate without having to scare off potential suspects or witnesses.
Which local was leading the other individual, or
Pardon me?
Ford is more of the driving force behind all this? And
I think the indications are that he was the primary mover in this situation.
Is it legal to have radium or possession of it?
Well, we're researching that. I don't know. I'd have to turn to my experts, but there are certain environmental concerns, both federal and state, that we have to research a little more heavily, depending on the way it's being transported, who is transporting it, if it's being transported or just being possessed. Remember, as Mr. Holland said, in the 40s and 50s, you know, radium was a common, very small doses, was common in many physicians' offices for the treatment of a number of ailments. This is before we really had a handle on the extent and the ramifications of using this type of material.
How many guns, knives? Give us an inventory of, how much stuff.
You know, Carol, I always like to prepare myself, but you always bring up questions that I can't answer. But I tell you what, together after this conference, you and I will go around and count every one of these things, because I think we have every one we seized on view. But I really can't. I don't have an
Mr.
inventory.
Patterson, did you speak with some of the Suffolk County officials named in the press
Yes.
release who were the objects of
Yes. Were there
their reaction? Excuse me, and their reaction?
Well, you know, all three of them were genuinely concerned. And when you're talking about this type of unseen threat and all of a sudden become aware that something could be going on that you had no knowledge of. A gunman you possibly can see coming at you, or a person with a knife. But when someone's talking about spreading radioactive material in or near you, or your home, or your family, obviously very, very Mr. Powell was quite concerned about it. Mr. Toll as well as Mr. Gazzola.
Were there others besides those three mentioned in the presentation?
Well, other people were mentioned, but not to the level that these three were brought under consideration.
Mr. Patterson, were you
Are
mentioned?
you a target of the attack?
Wait, I can't answer two questions.
I understand one canister was actually found leaking at the scene.
I'd have to turn.
Is that true, and is there any danger if that happened?
In fact, the lid was off one, there was no leak. There is an inner container.
So there was no danger?
There was no danger of the stuff leaking out, no.
Mr. Patterson, were you on that list, or were you mentioned?
Well, you know, I'm mentioned many times in many ways by a lot of people, and I would say that my name turned up in it, but I, having heard some of the communication, don't consider the threat to my person any more than it has been in other areas that, you know, go with the job. And I'm not being a martyr about it. I mean, all public officials, particularly law enforcement, are subject to this type of talk. But I didn't put that in the same, neither did Mr. Thompson, and he has other motives. He didn't put me in the same risk level as Mr. Powell, Mr. Toll. And I don't mean to minimize this at all.
Were you mentioned?
Yes, my
Do you
name is
believe that this has to do with the dump that was the Brookhaven dump that's behind where he lived, where Ford lived, that these particular people were targeted because of their... I'm just asking.
We found Mr. Ford at 11 o'clock last night. We have not been able to discuss anything with him. He immediately requested a lawyer, so some of his inner thinking motivations are going to have to remain that way until someone else reveals them. We don't know.
What was said about the three men who were targeted? Why?
Pardon me?
What was said about the three men who were targeted? What was the mood from what you were able to gather?
I think the mood was extreme hostility towards these three individuals. I don't want to go any further than that at this time. I think Mr. Powell was far and away the prime target here. The others were strong targets. I don't know whether it has to do completely with politics, or whether it has to do with dashed hopes for political appointment. I have no idea, and I don't know that much about this gentleman. I do know that he is consumed with very strong hatreds.
Had they ever had any relationship or interaction with these men, any of the three men named?
Not to my knowledge.
Any
Mr.
contact?
Powell knows who the gentleman is. There have been some political conflict, I'm sure, but other than that, no. No
He had
reason to
met him?
single him out.
But he had met him
He
before?
knew who he was. I don't know whether he had met him or not.
Is politics in any way an issue here? I mean, we're talking a bunch of Republicans that apparently were targeted. Were these guys Democrats? Is there political...
Well, first of all, Mr. Gazzola is a conservative. In fact, he's a conservative leader of Brookhaven Town, I believe, or was. I can't rule it out, but I don't know. And, you know, one man's politics and the other man's terrorism, depending on how the person looks at it.
Can you tell us, this is a gigantic weapons cage. I mean, how many people could this amount of weapons arm?
Well, when Carol and I finished the count, I think we have about, off the top of my head, we probably have about 20, 22.